My name is Abby. I'd always been told it was dangerous to travel alone. But when I decided to drive from Minneapolis to Arizona in search of my dad, danger wasn't something I could afford to consider. He disappeared 19 years ago when I was just a baby. No goodbye, no trace, nothing. A couple of weeks ago, though, I got a tip from someone who claimed they'd seen him in a small Arizona town, and for the first time, I had hope. It was enough to make me pack my bags, hop in my car, and drive 1,500 miles straight into the unknown. The first couple of days were uneventful, just me and the open road. I'd never driven this far alone before, and I quickly realized how isolating it could feel. Mile after mile, highway after highway, towns grew smaller and stretches of road longer. By the third day, I was somewhere in the middle of New Mexico, heading toward Arizona. The desert surrounded me, vast and endless, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. That's when my car died. It started with a sputter, then a jolt, and finally, the engine gave out completely. I coasted to the side of the road, the silence almost deafening without the hum of the engine. When I tried to restart the car, all I got was a weak click. My heart sank. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and no one in sight. I sat there for a moment, trying not to panic. The desert night was creeping in fast, and with it came a bone-chilling cold. I decided to wait for a car to pass. Someone would come by eventually, right? But as the minutes ticked by and the darkness deepened, the vast emptiness of the desert began to feel suffocating. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was a car coming down the highway, but as the lights got closer, I realized they weren't headlights. They were dim, flickering, like lanterns, and they were coming from the desert itself. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the lights move closer, slowly weaving through the darkness, too steady to belong to anything natural. I locked my doors, my heart pounding. The lights came to a stop about 50 yards away, just far enough that I couldn't make out who or what was holding them. I tried to tell myself it was just a group of hikers or campers, but the silence was unsettling. No voices, no sounds of footsteps, just the faint glow of the lights. Then, one of them started moving again. The lantern, or whatever it was, bobbed through the darkness, heading straight for my car. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with my keys, trying the ignition again. Nothing. The figure holding the light came closer, close enough that I could see the outline of a person. They were tall, their features obscured by the flickering glow. They stopped about 20 feet away, the lantern swinging slightly in their hand. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze locked on me. I ducked down in my seat, my heart racing so loud I thought they might hear it. A few seconds passed, then I heard it, a tap on the glass. My entire body froze. The tap came again, louder this time. Slowly, I lifted my head to look. The figure was standing right outside my window now, the lantern casting an eerie glow over their face. It was a man, but his expression was blank, almost lifeless. His eyes met mine, and he smiled. A slow, unnatural grin that made my skin crawl.
"Need some help?"
he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I shook my head, too scared to speak. He tapped the glass again, harder this time.
"Open the door,"
he said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. I shook my head again, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The man's smile faltered, and he leaned closer to the window.
"Open the door,"
he repeated, louder this time. Before I could react, a set of headlights appeared behind him, flooding the area with light. The man froze, his body silhouetted against the brightness, before slowly stepping back into the shadows. I turned to see a semi-truck pulling to a stop on the shoulder of the highway. Relief washed over me as the trucker climbed out of his cab, his flashlight sweeping across the scene. The trucker approached my car, his flashlight shining into the window. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. In that moment, something about him felt safe, like an anchor in a storm. I nodded, rolling down the window just enough to speak. My car broke down. I don't know what to do. The trucker glanced over his shoulder, toward the direction the man had vanished. His jaw tightened, and his eyes scanned the darkness before turning back to me. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his tone serious but kind. "I'll call it in and take you to the nearest station. You shouldn't be out here alone." His words hit me like a wave of relief. For the first time that night, the way he spoke without hesitation made tears well up in my eyes. I didn't even know this man, but he exuded this undeniable energy, like the kind of dad I'd always imagined having. Solid, protective. When he knelt by my car to check something on the tires, I broke down. The tears came fast and unrelenting, spilling out of me in a way I couldn't stop. It wasn't just the fear of the night or the relief of being saved. It was something deeper. Something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying with me my whole life. "I'm sorry," I managed to choke out as I wiped my face. "It's just, I never grew up with a dad and you don't even know me, but you're helping me and I..." My words trailed off into sobs. He stood up and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, his expression softening. "You don't have to apologize for that," he said quietly. "Sometimes, people just need someone to step in. Everyone deserves that." At that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. Like, no matter what had just happened, I was going to be okay because someone was there who cared enough to help. I wasn't used to that. I don't know how long I sat there crying, but he didn't rush me. He just stood by, making sure I had time to pull myself together before getting back to work. When he started attaching my car to his truck, he talked about little things. How he'd been driving trucks for years. How he'd helped people stuck on the road plenty of times. Not in a way that felt boastful, but just enough to calm me down, to remind me that there were still good people in the world. As we drove toward the nearest station, I thought about how many men like him, strangers with good hearts, step into dangerous situations just to help people like me. I'll never forget the gratitude I felt in that moment. I hadn't known my father, but for a brief moment, I imagined this must be what it would have felt like, to have someone who makes you feel like nothing bad could touch you as long as they're around. "Thank you," I said softly as we pulled into the station parking lot. He glanced over at me, a small, reassuring smile on his face. "Just glad I could help," he said. "That's what we're supposed to do, isn't it?" The officers there listened to my story, but their reactions were guarded as if they'd heard something like this before. They told me I wasn't the first person to report strange encounters in that stretch of desert, but they couldn't explain who the man was or why he'd been there. I never found my dad. I stayed in Arizona for a week, asking questions and following leads, but it all came up empty. Still, I can't ignore the feeling that whoever or whatever I encountered that night wasn't a coincidence. Sometimes, late at night, I'll think about the man with the lantern and wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to cross his path. My name is Eddie, and this happened to me a few years ago. I was on my way back from visiting my daughter at her college, NAU in Flagstaff. I was driving through the long, empty stretches of Arizona desert. It was late, just past 10 p.m., and the night was pitch black, the kind of dark that swallows everything beyond your headlights. My Ford's engine hummed steadily as I cruised down the desolate highway, trying to ignore the creeping fatigue settling in. There wasn't much out here, just me, the road, and the occasional flicker of stars above. About 30 miles past the last small town, a dirt road appeared on my right. Normally, I wouldn't give it a second glance, but as my headlights swept across it, something caught my eye. A white van, broken down just a few yards off the road. It was tilted slightly to one side, like it had blown a tire, and its back doors were closed but slightly ajar. I wasn't the type to stop for strangers, especially not this far out in the middle of nowhere, but something about the van felt off. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated the back of it, and my stomach dropped. There was blood smeared on the doors, dark, streaky smears that trailed down toward the bumper. I slowed to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me screamed to keep driving, to get as far away from that van as possible, but curiosity, and maybe some foolish sense of responsibility, won out. I pulled off onto the dirt road and parked about 20 feet away, leaving my engine running as I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment. The air was eerily still as I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, but I couldn't turn back now. I approached the van slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The blood on the back doors was dried, but fresh enough that it hadn't turned completely brown yet. My throat tightened as I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. Inside, the van was a mess. The floor was littered with crumpled maps, ropes coiled in messy piles, and photographs scattered everywhere. I picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It was a picture of a man, smiling, standing in front of what looked like a gas station. I grabbed another photo, this one of a woman, sitting in a park. Each photo was different, but they all had one thing in common. They looked candid, taken without the subject knowing. I swallowed hard and backed away from the van. This wasn't just some broken-down vehicle. This was something much worse. I turned and started walking back to my car, my pace quickening as panic set in. That's when I saw them. Headlights. They appeared in the distance, faint at first, then growing brighter as the vehicle approached the dirt road. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. Whoever this van belonged to was coming back. I bolted to my car, flung the door open, and dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, throwing the Ford into reverse just as the other vehicle turned onto the dirt road. The truck was dark, its windows tinted so heavily I couldn't make out a thing inside. It came to a stop near the van, idling for a moment, and for a brief, fleeting second, I thought I might have escaped their notice. Then a loud pop shattered the silence. The sound echoed across the empty desert. I froze, heart racing, before the unmistakable ping of something hitting metal snapped me out of it. My windshield cracked, a spiderweb spreading across the glass. They were shooting at me. Before I could even think, the truck's headlights swung in my direction, piercing through the darkness like twin spotlights. The engine roared as the vehicle lurched forward, barreling straight toward me. I floored the gas. The tires screeched as I shot down the highway, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The truck's headlights loomed behind me, growing brighter with every passing second. Whoever was driving it wasn't just following me, they were chasing me. I pushed the Ford as hard as I could, the speedometer climbing past 80, then 90, then 100 miles per hour. The road was completely empty, just an endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the desert, and the truck was keeping pace. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the headlights were there, glaring like the eyes of some predatory animal. The truck swerved into the opposite lane, pulling up beside me for a moment before jerking back behind me. They were toying with me, trying to scare me, or worse, trying to force me off the road. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white as I tried to keep the car steady. The desert blurred past in the darkness, the occasional tumbleweed darting across the road. Minutes felt like hours as the chase continued, my car roaring down the highway at over 100 miles per hour. I kept hoping for a car, a sign, something, anything, but the road stretched on, barren and lifeless. My phone was in the cup holder, but there was no way I could call for help now. I could barely keep the car on the road as it was. Then suddenly, the truck's headlights disappeared. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat as I glanced in the mirror. Nothing. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. I slowed down slightly, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirrors. There was no sign of them. No headlights, no sound, nothing. Had they given up, or were they waiting for me to stop? I didn't dare find out. I pressed the gas pedal again, keeping my speed up as I drove through the night. I didn't stop until I saw the distant glow of a city on the horizon. It felt like salvation, like I'd finally escaped whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. I headed straight for the nearest police station in the city, too afraid to stop at any of the small town stations along the way. I didn't know if the truck was still out there, waiting, and I wasn't going to take any chances. When I told the officers what had happened, they listened carefully but seemed skeptical. They took my statement and said they'd send someone to check the van, but I could tell they didn't think they'd find anything. And maybe they wouldn't. Maybe whoever was behind that truck had already cleaned up, disappeared into the night. I haven't driven through the desert since that night. I can't even think about it without feeling that same cold dread creeping over me. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, my mind flashing back to the sound of the truck's engine roaring behind me. And I'll wonder, what would have happened if they'd caught me? Arizona's endless deserts have their beauty, but they can feel isolating, even eerie, especially at night. I moved to a small town outside of Phoenix last summer, wanting to get away from the chaos of city life. My job as a freelance photographer made it easy to work from anywhere, and I'd been looking forward to exploring the breathtaking landscapes Arizona had to offer. But it wasn't long before I experienced something that would make me rethink my decision. One evening, I decided to drive out to a remote spot I'd heard about, a stretch of desert known for its stunning rock formations and sweeping views. The sun was setting as I parked my car on a dirt road just off the highway. The sky was a fiery orange, casting long shadows across the barren terrain. There wasn't another car or person in sight, which at the time I appreciated. I grabbed my camera and headed out into the open desert. I wandered for about an hour, snapping photos as the daylight faded into twilight. The desert was eerily quiet. No animals, no breeze, just the crunch of my boots on the sand. As the sky turned a deep purple, I realized it was time to head back. The last thing I wanted was to be out here alone after dark. As I turned back toward my car, I froze. In the distance, I saw what looked like a person standing near the edge of a rocky outcrop. They weren't moving, just standing there, silhouetted against the horizon. My first thought was that it was another photographer, maybe someone who knew the area better than I did. But the figure's stillness unnerved me. No camera, no movement, just standing. I tried to ignore the unease creeping over me and kept walking. The figure was far enough away that I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. But as I got closer to my car, I realized the figure wasn't on the outcrop anymore. They were gone. The logical part of my brain told me they'd probably just walked away. But when I reached my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, leading right up to my car and then circling it before heading back toward the desert. I didn't waste any time. I unlocked the door, jumped in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, my headlights swept across the area, and for a split second, I saw the figure again. This time, they were standing about 50 feet away, half hidden behind a cluster of rocks. I couldn't make out their face, but I could tell they were watching me. I hit the gas, kicking up dust as I sped back toward the highway. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was over. Whoever it was, they were just some weirdo trying to scare me, or so I thought. As I drove back toward town, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. The highway was dark, with no streetlights, just the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. That's when I noticed something in my rearview mirror, a pair of headlights in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a highway, of course there'd be other cars. But the headlights weren't gaining on me or fading away. They were keeping the exact same distance, even as I sped up or slowed down. I told myself I was being paranoid, but as I reached the outskirts of town, I decided to test a theory. I turned onto a side road leading into a residential area. The car behind me followed. I made another turn. So did they. My chest tightened. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever it was had been following me for miles. I didn't want to lead them to my house, so I turned onto a busier street, hoping to lose them. The headlights stayed with me. Finally, I decided to head to the police station. I knew there was one about 5 minutes away, and I figured whoever was behind me would back off once they saw where I was going. As I pulled into the station's parking lot, the car behind me slowed down but didn't stop. It idled at the entrance for a moment, its headlights glaring, before turning around and driving off. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. I didn't go inside the station. I wasn't even sure what I'd say. I just wanted to go home and forget about the whole thing. But when I finally got back to my house, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I hadn't noticed it at the police station, but it was there now, flapping slightly in the breeze. I didn't want to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. Scrawled on the paper, in shaky handwriting, were just 2 words: nice car. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, maybe even waiting for me to let my guard down. I never went back to that part of the desert, and to this day, I always park in well-lit areas and keep my doors locked, even in the middle of the day. Some people might call me paranoid, but after that night, I call it being careful. Because in Arizona's vast, empty deserts, you never know who or what might be out there.